ninth edition of the World Public Relations Forum was held in May in Toronto, Canada, on the theme Communication Across Cultures. The forum was one of the largest assemblies of public relations and communications professionals from around the world, and a unique opportunity to gather professionals with academics producing important outcomes for the advancement of the profession. Well, for feedback, I have with me Daniel Manslau, Principal Consultant of the VMA Group. Welcome. Great to have you with us again, Daniel.
Great to be back. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Give us a sense of this gathering that took place with PR and communication professionals, and why is this forum so pivotal for the industry?
Well, the World PR Forum is, as you said, one of the largest gatherings of communicators in the world, and certainly the most culturally representative. It takes place every second year, and probably about 750 delegates attend from over 30 countries, with speakers from 20 plus countries. So it really, you do get an opportunity to have exposure to thought leaders from all corners of the markets, from professional, corporate, consulting, academia, and it's an opportunity for everybody to share their ideas and look at what the latest trends are, new exciting things that are happening in the technology space, in the research space. But this year's theme was all focused on cross-cultural communication. And I think that's something that no matter where in the world you work, it's becoming more and more relevant to understand how to engage your stakeholders and better understand your stakeholders to get better communication outcomes from them.
What are some of the challenges facing communicators when it comes to cross-cultural communication? I'm sure that's a very wide question, but perhaps if you can narrow it down in terms of what was discussed at the forum and what came up for you as well as a contributor.
I think one of the biggest challenges when you have multinational global organizations that operate in multiple markets is the intricacy of understanding and immersing in the markets in which you operate in. And it's not enough to just send a blanket message out there and assume that because the message works in one market, it's automatically going to work in another. So there were a number of really fantastic speakers from around the world that gave practical examples of that. I'll share three with you. We had Alex Malouf, who is based in Dubai, and he works for Procter & Gamble. And he spoke at length about how they did consumer immersion in various markets in which they operate. So from a P&G point of view and the consumer products that they share, it's not enough to do, for example, a classic focus group to understand how the product will land in a particular market from a marketing and advertising and a PR point of view. But how do you actually sit in a community around a fireplace, if that is the way in which that community gets together in the evening, literally in the traditional sense, and engage with them in asking questions that will generate the themes that will then inform the advertising, marketing, and PR strategies. So that was one example, very, very practical.
Is this happening?
How they do it. It is happening. It's a real case study of how Procter & Gamble is really immersing in the markets in which they're operating. If we look at another example from GlaxoSmithKline, the former recent global comms director, Janet Morgan, shared a fantastic presentation, case study, about how they rolled out corporate social investment worldwide, but she focused on Africa and the intricate need to understand what the CSR hotspots are for this continent. So, for example, if you're working in West Africa, a few years ago, obviously the Ebola crisis was major. HIV/AIDS is obviously a more prominent issue on the continent than it might be in other markets. So it was how they adapted the CSI program to go into that market, do an immersion exercise and say, what is it that impacts on you the most? Where do you see us as a brand impacting on that community? And she said it was a massive eye-opener, because if you sit at the head office in London or Zurich or Berlin and you engage with a particular market, it's very different to the way in which you need to engage in a market in a small outlying community in rural Ghana, for example. And the third and final example, which was also really, really interesting, was the way in which the Red Cross had to engage with communities. And the global head of stakeholder engagement, actually funnily enough a doctor by profession, not necessarily a communicator, was talking about the degree to which they had to engage with stakeholders in Guinea, in Senegal, in Sierra Leone, in countries where the Ebola outbreak was so significant. And unlike being able to send an email or slap up a poster on a billboard or something, they actually had to fly in megaphones and distribute them to their volunteers in those areas, and they had to go from town to educate people about the importance of burial, So, for example, a lot of communities have very entrenched values and beliefs around the way in which you treat people who have passed away. But obviously, the viruses are spread by those bodies,
Yeah.
and it's a very difficult subject to talk about. But the
Fascinating
reality
examples.
is how you actually engage with it. How do you dispel long-held beliefs about the fact that you leave the body out to pay respect, but in doing so, you could be perpetuating the illnesses. And obviously, through doing that, through thorough stakeholder engagement, you actually save lives.
Yeah.
Because you're helping people understand what the realities, the medical realities are. And by doing so, and by changing those, the way in which they do things, you're able to save lives.
So from what I gather from what you just said, there is this growing awareness amongst PR and communication experts to find non-traditional ways of reaching out to communities to actually engage with them. So this is a growing interest, and it is happening, is what you're saying, but there are challenges.
There are significant challenges, and I was very fortunate and very privileged to be one of the speakers from South Africa to present a paper in one of the workshops. And if we elevate the conversation from a tactical, very pragmatic point of view, as those three speakers used, research that we did in February across Africa among nearly 400 communicators from 251 companies shared with us what they saw their significant challenges to be in communicating in Africa. Now that becomes very important. So if you're a global organization looking at either running a comms function in Africa from a distance or building up a team in Africa, you need to understand what the local challenges are. And they were identified at the moment as being downward pressure on budget, which is linked to the broader macroeconomic climate. It had to do with a skills shortage. It had to do with the complexity and breadth of audiences that we have in terms of our stakeholder communication, silos within organizations, and leadership communication. Now, I think that's really important because if you're sitting in New York and you're running a global comms function, you need to understand that if you don't have the challenge of engaging with your leader in the New York office, the communicator that you deal with here, who's dealing with the office locally, might have a challenge that the leadership is not as open to engaging directly with stakeholders internally and externally as the teams overseas. So that identifies room where you need to develop your skills, where you need to focus better communication efforts to ultimately get what you want out of stakeholders.
So we're talking about investing in long, elaborate communication processes to achieve results. That's what we're talking about.
It is.
It goes beyond just understanding a language, but it's about structural challenges within a cultural community as well. To understand those structural challenges to actually ensure that your message reaches that person.
It is. And it's different in every market. So you really need to understand the market that you're in. One global communication policy simply does not work. If it's a CSI project, as per the example of GSK, that did a brilliant job customizing it to the different markets, it's still adhered to the business priorities, it's still adhered to the reputational priorities, but at the end of the day, it was relevant to that market. You know, I had the privilege and opportunity of running a communication measurement workshop for a client based in Thailand. But we had 12 communicators from 9 countries across the Asia-Pac market sitting in one room. You can imagine the cultural nuances and the challenges of engaging with a market like that. But it's about not just understanding the basics of cross-cultural communication in terms of body language, paraverbal, non-verbal communication. It's about appreciating and immersing yourself in taking the time to understand the history of the different markets and how that leads people to communicate differently.
So how did you manage that meeting?
It was a very interesting
And what
meeting.
was the outcome like?
It was a fantastic meeting and a fantastic outcome, but I think the way in which you prepare yourself is, as I say, the textbook stuff we know. But it's about going back and understanding the history. For example, we're approaching the 35th anniversary or independence anniversary of Taiwan and China. If you go back and you look at the history between the two countries and you understand the conflict between the countries historically and how much it's evolved now, you know better how to simply show cultural sensitivity and how to engage them in a very equal way to ensure that they have an equal voice so that you don't dredge up issues that historically were a challenge to them. So it's all about understanding your market, understanding your audience. It doesn't have to mean that you put very complex processes in place, but it's about understanding what is happening in different markets.
For example, a basic example in South Africa is understanding BEE codes. If you're a multinational company and you want to invest in South Africa, you need to get your head around these codes, which can be perceived to be impediments to doing business. It can either make or break a business interest in a foreign country.
That's an excellent example. CSI is another example where CSI globally is very focused on sustainability, on CO2 emissions. It's a lot more self-actualized. But if you look at local CSI projects, they really are about investing in schools to produce a middle class of 2030. So they're very different priorities. But that's why you have to take business priorities and at a high level country and societal priorities, link them to reputational priorities, and then how are you seen to be doing good but actually showing a difference in the community. So it's a lot more what's in it for me, my family, my community, as opposed to saying I'm going out there to save the ozone layer.
Exactly.
There's quite a difference. I'm not saying it's not important to go and save the ozone layer, but at the end of the day, you need to say what is relevant in my market.
And obviously, to bring it down to multinationals wanting to invest in other countries, you're going to have to engage with communities. You're going to have to employ people from local communities in order to make a difference in their lives and to have contributions coming through. You have to understand where they're coming from as well. That's the very basics of cross-cultural communication, where it affects the bottom line, it affects productivity, etc.
Absolutely. And you know, research and measurement starts playing a pivotal role when we talk about this. Because locally, not enough companies invest enough in measuring to obtain factual empirical data of what is happening to make informed strategic communication decisions that will achieve business objectives. So it's important to invest more in the research, more in the measurement to understand what's actually happening on the ground. It also gives business an opportunity to produce financial correlations and ROI to the communication efforts that are being put in place, which also affords communicators a better opportunity to take credit for and show a difference of the work that they're doing. I think that's a very important aspect as well.
How is this overarching theme, the discussions that took place at this international forum, linked to PRISA's objectives as well at its conference?
Look, they're very closely aligned. So the PRISA conference that's taking place in mid-August in Durban is also going to focus broadly on the theme of RISE. So how do we as a communication industry move ourselves forward on all the key drivers around business communication, from cross-cultural communication to leadership, crisis, social measurement, etc., in order to say, how do we remain relevant for 2020? And I link that to a very interesting presentation that I attended in New Orleans 2 weeks ago, just after the World PR Forum. And it was presented by the managing director of the Automobile Association of America. And the theme of her presentation was very simple: adapt or die. And we need to find ways of saying, are we change ready enough that we are flexible and agile enough to change quickly enough to the growing needs of business? And that goes back to where PRISA's national conference comes in, is equipping all delegates with the key strategic tools of saying, are you ready to rise to the occasion of being relevant in 2020, equipping you with the practical skills to handle what's important to business these days.
My final question to you, Daniel. In terms of the feedback you received through your participation at this forum, what kind of insights came through for you in terms of where PR and communication experts are taking the industry forward here in South Africa, in Africa? How do we fare? How are we doing?
That's an excellent question. And I think that in many ways, let me say this differently. We as South Africans should be exceptionally proud of the quality of work that we produce. Having been now to the World PR Forum, I have no qualms in hesitation in saying that in many aspects our work is as good as, if not better, than other work that is produced by some global organizations and agencies. We really do fantastic work. Our creative execution is superb. Our ability to engage with different demographics and different audiences is exceptional. Where there is still room for improvement, I think, is on the measurement front, where when you speak to leading organizations that are actually able to put communication as a profit center, because they're actually showing a tangible ROI, that's an area where we are certainly on the right trajectory, but there is definitely room for improvement. We also need to develop better business acumen skills to engage leaders to make them in turn better business communicators. The research also supports that by showing that senior communicators are saying leadership is a challenge. They're not engaging enough with the audience. Leaders think that speaking at an annual roadshow or going and doing a quarterly roadshow to tell staff what is happening in the business is communication. It's not. All it is keeping people informed. It's not engagement. That is an area where I think there's also still room for improvement, and there's definitely room to improve at the slightly more strategic level, not so much a tactical level, but bringing things much more tightly knit into business objectives. So I think there's a balance, but overall, I think we can be very proud of the work that we produce.
Danielle, thank you so much for your time, for your excellent feedback. You always have so much to contribute. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
It's our pleasure.